General Aleksei Vinogradov is standing beside his command vehicle on the Raate Road in eastern Finland on the morning of December the 27th, 1939, and he is looking at a map that does not tell him what he needs to know. He is 41 years old. He commands the Soviet 44th Rifle Division, a formation of approximately 17,000 men that has spent the past 2 weeks moving west along this road through unbroken pine forest, ordered to relieve the 163rd Division, which is somewhere ahead of him in the dark, trapped in the town of Suomussalmi and dying. The map in his hands shows the road. The road exists. He can see it. It is the only road. What the map does not show him, what no map available to the Soviet Ninth Army can show him in any useful way, is what the forest on either side of the road actually means for a division of 17,000 men strung out along 40 kilometers of single track through Finnish wilderness in December at -40 degrees Celsius, with Finnish ski troops somewhere in those trees and no way of knowing where. He folds the map. He gives an order to continue the advance. It is the last order he gives as the commander of a functioning division. Within days, the 44th Division will be cut to pieces on this road. Within weeks, Vinogradov will be stood against a wall in front of his surviving officers and shot. The road will still be there, buried under snow, and on it will be the frozen remains of tanks and horses and artillery pieces and the men who had driven them west into a country that was not going to let them leave. This is not the story of the Winter War. That story is larger than any one road or any one division. This is the story of the Raate Road, 30 kilometers of forest track in central Finland that became, in the first weeks of January 1940, the site of the most complete destruction of a modern mechanized column in the opening phase of any war in the 20th century. It is the story of what happens when an army built for open terrain meets terrain it has no doctrine for, commanded by officers who have been given objectives without the means to achieve them and who cannot retreat because retreat has been defined by the political system that built their army as a crime equivalent to treason. It is the story of the 44th Division, where it came from, how it got onto the Raate Road, what the Finnish defenders under Colonel Hjalmar Silasvuo did to it, and what the Soviet Union learned from the wreckage. And it begins not on the road itself but in Kiev in the autumn of 1939, with the orders that set Vinogradov's division in motion. The 44th Rifle Division is, by Soviet standards in 1939, a good formation. It is stationed near Kiev and draws its enlisted strength primarily from Ukraine, which means its men are, on average, better fed and better clothed than soldiers drawn from the most rural parts of the Soviet interior. It has its full complement of tanks, artillery, and support vehicles. It has experienced officers, experienced in the Soviet sense of having survived the purges of 1937 and 1938, that swept away 3 of the 5 Soviet marshals, 13 of the 15 army commanders, 50 of the 57 corps commanders, and 154 of the 186 divisional commanders. The officers who remain in command positions by 1939 are there either because they were politically reliable, because they were junior enough to be beneath the purge's notice, or because they were fortunate. Vinogradov falls into a combination of these categories. He is politically reliable. He is competent by the standards of what is left. He is also, like every divisional commander in the Red Army in the autumn of 1939, aware that failure is not an option in any merely military sense. Failure is a crime. Commanders who fail are not relieved. They are arrested. The 44th Division receives its orders in late November 1939. It is to move north from Ukraine to the Karelian region of the Soviet-Finnish border, join the 9th Army under General Mikhail Dukhanov, and be prepared for offensive operations in Finland. The Soviet Union has been building toward war with Finland for weeks. The political pretext, a border incident at Manila that historians have long considered a Soviet fabrication, has been manufactured. The diplomatic demands have been made and rejected. On November 30th, 1939, the Soviet Union invades Finland along a front of 1,300 kilometers. Stalin expects the campaign to last 2 weeks. His foreign minister Vyacheslav Molotov, speaking on Soviet radio, says that Soviet aircraft are not dropping bombs on Finnish cities, but delivering bread to starving Finnish workers. This is the institutional confidence, the specific blend of ideological certainty and military overconfidence, inside which Vinogradov and the 44th Division operate as they move north in December 1939. The 44th Division's specific mission is determined by the operational situation it encounters when it arrives. The 163rd Division, which preceded it into Finland along the Raate Road, has captured the town of Suomussalmi in early December. Suomussalmi sits at the junction of 2 lakes, Kiantajärvi and Kaivajärvi, and controlling it theoretically opens a route to the Gulf of Bothnia that would cut Finland in 2. The 163rd does capture Suomussalmi. It does not control anything around it. Finnish Colonel Hjalmar Sielasvuo, commanding the Finnish forces in the region with approximately 11,000 men against the 163rd's 14,000, has allowed the Soviet division to enter the town and has then cut the road behind it. The 163rd is isolated in Suomussalmi. It cannot advance, it cannot retreat. It is burning whatever it can find to stay warm and sending radio messages to the 9th Army reporting that it has food for 4 days and that the temperature is dropping. The 9th Army's solution is the 44th Division. Vinogradov is ordered to advance along the Raate Road from the east, reach Suomussalmi and relieve the 163rd. The distance is approximately 40 kilometers of forest road. 40 kilometers. On a map in December, with 17,000 men and tanks and artillery, it looks achievable. It is achievable in the sense that the road physically exists and the distance is finite. What the operational planners at 9th Army headquarters do not adequately account for, what Soviet military planning in Finland consistently fails to account for, is what the terrain around that road is actually like and what Finnish ski troops can do in it. The Raate Road in December 1939 is a dirt track. In normal Finnish winter conditions, it becomes a surface of packed snow and ice that can support vehicle traffic, which is why it was chosen as the route for a motorized column. On either side of it, for as far as a man can see in any direction, is Finnish forest, pine and birch and spruce, so dense that a soldier cannot move through it without noise, cannot see more than 20 meters in any direction, cannot orientate himself without compass and intimate knowledge of the terrain. The forest is interrupted by frozen lakes, by bogs that are treacherous even in their frozen state, by ridges and gullies that do not appear on Soviet maps in sufficient detail to be useful. It is, for a Soviet motorized column, the worst possible terrain in the world. It is, for Finnish ski troops who grew up in it, home. The Soviet 9th Army, under whose operational authority the Raate Road column moves, is itself an institution under pressure that shapes every decision made within it. General Mikhail Dukhanov, commanding the 9th, is operating with directives from the Leningrad military district under General Kirill Meretskov, who is in turn operating with expectations set in Moscow by Kliment Voroshilov, the People's Commissar of Defense, who is in turn reflecting the timetable that Stalin has communicated through the political channels that parallel and supervise the military ones. The chain of pressure is not a chain of information. Each level of this hierarchy passes the objective downward and the pressure downward, but the information that should flow upward, accurate reporting of what the terrain is like, what the Finnish defenses are doing, what the rate of advance that the ground actually permits, flows upward only imperfectly, filtered at each level by the awareness that accurate reporting of failure carries the same institutional risk as the failure itself. Dukhanov knows that the 44th Division's advance is slower than planned. He knows the terrain is worse than the maps suggested. He knows the Finnish forces facing the column are not the disorganized militia that pre-war intelligence described. He does not report these facts to Merezkov in terms that would trigger a reconsideration of the operation, because reporting them in those terms would invite the question of why the operation is not proceeding on schedule. And that question, directed at Dukhanov, has no safe answer. He adjusts the reporting language. He describes the situation as challenging but manageable. He demands more speed from Vinogradov. He does not provide more resources because he does not have them to provide. The gap between what the operation requires and what the Ninth Army can actually supply is papered over at each level of the command chain until the gap becomes the Raate Road. The planning failures that put the 44th Division on the Raate Road are not, in their individual components, unusual. Armies fight in terrain for which their doctrine is imperfect. Commanders receive orders based on intelligence that is inadequate. Supply chains fail to deliver what forward units need. These are the common conditions of military operations, and armies throughout history have managed them, badly or well, through the exercise of command judgment at the appropriate level. What is unusual about the situation Vinogradov faces is that the institutional mechanism for managing these common failures, the ability of a commander to tell his superior that the plan does not match the ground and to receive a modified order in response, has been substantially destroyed by the political conditions of the Red Army in 1939. The purges of 1937 and 1938 removed the officers who might have been willing to report difficult truths accurately. The political commissar system, which places a Communist Party official with authority to countermand or report any commander, ensures that those who remain are aware of the consequences of honesty. And the specific military culture created by a decade of Soviet industrialization ideology, the culture that treats large numbers, large quotas, and the assertion of superhuman will against material obstacles as the fundamental expression of socialist progress, makes the honest assessment of an obstacle sound like defeatism. Vinogradov does not lack the ability to see what is happening. He lacks the institutional space to say what he sees in terms that could produce a different result. Vinogradov begins his advance in the third week of December. The column stretches for most of the road's length. Tanks at the front, then infantry, then artillery pieces pulled by horses, then supply vehicles, then more infantry, then the rearguard. At its maximum extension, the column occupies 40 kilometers of road. The men and vehicles are packed onto the road surface because there is nowhere else to go. Deploying off the road means entering the forest, and entering the forest without skis and without knowledge of the terrain is not a tactical option. It is a way of losing men in the dark. The column is a single file of everything the 44th Division owns, strung out through the trees, and every man in it knows there is only one way in and one way out. Silasvuo sees the column coming. He has intelligence from Finnish observers positioned in the forest. He knows the column's length, its approximate composition, its rate of advance. He is not afraid of it. He has just spent 3 weeks systematically destroying the 163rd Division in Suomussalmi, and he understands what Finnish ski troops can do to a Soviet column in Finnish forest at night. He makes his decision. He does not attack the 44th Division head-on at the western end of the road, which is what Soviet doctrine would expect, and what Vinogradov has positioned his tanks to repel. He attacks it at multiple points simultaneously along its entire length. His plan is not to stop the column. His plan is to cut it into sections and let the cold finish each section in turn. On the night of December 27th and 28th, Finnish ski troops emerge from the forest on both sides of the Raate Road at 5 separate points along the column's length. They cross the road under fire, cutting it, separating the tanks from the artillery, the infantry from the supply vehicles, the forward elements from the rear. They move fast, faster than a man can run through snow without skis, and they fire from positions in the tree line that are invisible to soldiers standing in the road's open space. The attacks are brief. Finnish soldiers do not stand and exchange fire at close range with a 17,000-man Soviet division. They cut the road, inflict casualties, and disappear back into the trees. By dawn on December 28th, the 44th Division is no longer a column. It is a series of isolated pockets, each one sitting on a section of road surrounded by forest and Finnish soldiers, unable to see its neighbors, unable to communicate reliably, unable to go forward or back. What happens inside those pockets over the following days and weeks is what gives the Raate Road its place in military history. The men of the 44th Division are not cowards. They are not individually incompetent. They are soldiers who have been placed in a situation that their training and their equipment have not prepared them for, commanded by officers who have been given no option to retreat and no realistic option to advance, in terrain that kills the unprepared as efficiently as any weapon. The temperature falls. At night, it reaches -40 degrees Celsius, which is the temperature at which lubricating oil in tank engines congeals, and engines will not start. At which the propellant charges in artillery shells lose enough chemical energy that the guns fire short. At which a man who stops moving will be unconscious within minutes and dead within an hour. Soviet soldiers in the pockets have tents, but tent fabric at -40 provides insulation only if there is a heat source inside it. Heat sources require fuel. Fuel is in the supply vehicles at the rear of the column, which are in their own pocket, unable to move forward through the Finnish-held sections of road. The tanks become shelters. Soviet soldiers cluster around tank engines for warmth, burning fuel that was supposed to be used for movement. Tank crews sleep inside their vehicles with the engines running, consuming what little fuel remains. When the fuel runs out, the tanks become cold steel boxes, and the men inside them die of hypothermia or abandon the vehicles to find warmth elsewhere and freeze in the open instead. The horses. The 44th Division has several hundred horses pulling artillery and supply sleds, are dying faster than the men. A horse cannot be sheltered in a tank. A horse that is not moving at -40 degrees will be dead in hours. The sound of dying horses, audible from a considerable distance in the frozen stillness of the forest, marks the location of the pockets for Finnish observers who need no other intelligence. Vinogradov, in his command element, understands what is happening. He sends radio messages to the 9th Army. The messages request permission to withdraw the division to the border. The 9th Army denies permission. Withdrawal has not been authorized. The political officer attached to his headquarters, the commissar whose function is both administrative and ideological, a man whose reports go directly to Moscow, makes clear that a request for withdrawal will be noted. The Finnish tactical execution deserves examination on its own terms because what Aleksei achieves on the Raate Road is not simply a product of terrain advantage. It is the product of a command culture so different from Vinogradov's that it might as well belong to a different species of military organization. Aleksei in December 1939 is 40 years old. He was born in Tampere and is a veteran of the Finnish Civil War of 1918, a conflict that gave Finland its military officer class and gave Aleksei his foundational understanding of what irregular forces operating in native terrain can do against a conventionally superior enemy. He is not a man who fights by doctrine. He fights by assessment of what the specific ground in front of him will permit and what his specific men can do in it. When he plans the motti operations against the 44th Division, he does not work from a template. He works from what his ski patrol commanders tell him about the road and the column and the gaps between Soviet units. He assigns objectives based on terrain features, the frozen lake crossing here, the ridge that flanks the road there, the gap between two vehicle clusters where Finnish troops can cross without being in Soviet fields of fire for more than 30 seconds. The plan is precise not because Aleksei has more resources than Vinogradov, but because he is working with information that Vinogradov cannot access, the knowledge of a man who understands the forest as an environment rather than as an obstacle. His battalion commanders operate with a degree of tactical independence that has no parallel in the Soviet formations they are fighting. When a Finnish battalion commander on the Raate Road sees an opportunity that was not in the original plan, a gap in the Soviet perimeter, a moment when the temperature has dropped far enough to make Soviet sentries less alert, a vehicle cluster that has separated from its neighbors. He acts on it without waiting for authorization from Silasvo's headquarters. He makes the decision himself, uses his force as the moment requires, and reports what happened afterward. This is not indiscipline. It is the product of a military culture that trains its officers to make decisions rather than request them. The Finnish army in 1939 is not a large or wealthy institution. It cannot afford the kind of top-down command structure that requires every action to be authorized at the appropriate hierarchical level before it can be executed. It trains its officers to act. The contrast with Vinogradov, who sends radio message after radio message to the 9th Army requesting guidance and permission, is not incidental. It is structural. The experience of ordinary Soviet soldiers in the Raate Road pockets is recorded in fragments: Finnish intelligence intercepts of Soviet radio communications, the accounts of survivors who eventually reached Soviet lines, the depositions taken from the small number of Soviet prisoners captured in reasonable condition, and the diaries and letters found on the bodies of men who did not survive. What emerges from these fragments is not primarily a story of military failure. It is a story of individual human beings attempting to survive in conditions that have exceeded the limits of what their institutional framework has prepared them for and what their physical equipment can support. A Soviet soldier in a Raate Road pocket in late December 1939 is not, in most cases, a man who has given up. He is a man who is trying to do what soldiers do in encirclement: hold his position, maintain discipline, wait for relief, in a temperature that makes holding a rifle with bare hands a way of losing fingers, in a darkness that descends by 3 in the afternoon and does not lift until 9 in the morning, in a silence broken only by Finnish harassing fire and the sound of horses dying and the wind moving through the frozen trees. The specific physical experience of cold at this extreme is worth describing precisely, because the abstraction of the phrase -40 degrees does not adequately convey what it means for a human body. At -40, the temperature differential from body core to ambient air is so extreme that heat loss through inadequately insulated clothing occurs faster than a resting body can generate it. A man standing still at -40 degrees will begin to lose core temperature within minutes. His hands lose sensation first, then his feet, then his face. The loss of sensation in the extremities is not painful in the way that a wound is painful. It is simply an absence. The hand that was there, holding the rifle, stops reporting its own existence, and the brain registers this as a kind of administrative notification rather than an alarm. This is the mechanism by which frostbite kills silently. Men in the Raate Road pockets developed frostbite in their hands and feet and did not know they had it until they attempted to move and found that what had been fingers were now rigid structures that would not flex. The treatment for frostbite in the Soviet medical supplies available in the pockets was inadequate for the scale of the problem. Surgeons at the Soviet rear area hospitals who received evacuated casualties from the pockets reported performing amputations in numbers that exceeded their capacity. The psychological dimension of the encirclement operates on a different timescale from the physical one. The physical deterioration is fast. The psychological deterioration follows it. Soviet soldiers in the pockets who could communicate with their neighbors, who were in adjacent sections of the road separated by 50 or 100 meters of Finnish-held ground, developed informal networks for sharing information that bypassed the official command structure. This information was not reliable. It mixed accurate observation with rumor and with the kind of catastrophic speculation that emerges when men who cannot see their situation clearly attempt to fill the gaps in their knowledge with inference. Rumors circulated in the pockets that relief was coming, that an armored column was advancing from the east, that the Finnish forces had been pulled away to deal with a breakthrough elsewhere. These rumours were false. They provided temporary relief from the weight of the actual situation, and then, when they did not materialize, contributed to the collapse of morale that the Finnish harassing fire was designed to accelerate. The Finns did not need to destroy the pockets by direct assault. They needed to ensure that the men in the pockets believed no relief was coming, because men who have stopped expecting relief stop functioning as soldiers. Vinogradov continues the radio messages. He requests reinforcement. He requests resupply by air. Soviet aircraft are not available for resupply operations in the quantities needed, and the weather that is killing his men is also grounding aircraft. He requests artillery support from outside the encirclement. The forest absorbs artillery fire without transferable effect on an enemy that has no fixed positions. The shells fall among the trees and kill trees. The Finns are methodical. Aleksei does not need to assault the pockets. Assault would cost Finnish lives, and Finnish lives are not expendable in the way that Soviet strategic planning has decided Soviet lives can be. He surrounds each pocket. He keeps it under fire, harassing fire, snipers, occasional mortar rounds that fall on the road where the Soviet soldiers are gathered. He shoots men who come out to gather firewood. He shoots men who cross open ground between vehicles. He does not need to destroy the pockets by force. He needs to wait. The cold and the hunger are doing his work. Inside the pockets, the social order of the Soviet division begins to fracture. Officers lose control of subunits that fragment and attempt individual breakouts. Individual breakouts enter the forest and do not return. Men who have weapons and ammunition and no specific objective to fire at shoot at sounds and shadows, expending ammunition that cannot be replaced. Food runs out. Men begin eating their dead horses. Men begin eating their dead horses in the dark at -40 degrees, hacking at frozen carcasses with entrenching tools. And this detail, reported by Finnish soldiers who observe it through field glasses and later confirmed by Soviet survivors, becomes one of the defining images of what the Raate Road means for the two armies that fight over it. Aleksei does attack when the time is right and the conditions have done enough of the preparation. Finnish ski troops assault individual pockets when their occupants are sufficiently weakened by cold and hunger that they cannot mount an effective defense. The attacks are sharp and brief. Finnish soldiers move in from the tree line, overwhelm the defensive positions on the road, take what weapons and equipment they can use, and withdraw before any surviving Soviet force can counterattack. They take prisoners, though the logistics of prisoners present problems that Finnish army planning in the Suomussalmi sector has not solved. Men who surrender to Finnish soldiers in the forest in January 1940 are sometimes held, sometimes released in the sense of pointed toward the east and told to walk, in conditions that make walking to the east a death sentence. The Soviet institutional response to Suomussalmi and the Raate Road, the response that goes beyond executing Vinogradov, unfolds across the following months in ways that are significant for understanding the larger arc of the war. Marshal Timoshenko, who replaces Meretskov in command of the Finnish operation in January 1940, conducts what amounts to an emergency recapitalization of Soviet tactical method in the specific conditions of Finnish winter warfare. His approach is not subtle. He identifies what went wrong in the motti battles with the precision of a man who has been given a broken army and told to fix it before the ice melts, because the ice melting will make the Finnish defensive line, the Mannerheim line, the concrete and steel fortification system across the Karelian Isthmus, even harder to attack. He issues orders that address the most visible failures: winter camouflage for all forward units, ski training for infantry formations that had been operating without skis, revised march discipline that prevents columns from stringing out beyond the ability of flank security to cover them, and explicit authorization for local commanders to request withdrawal to defensible positions when their supply situation becomes untenable. This last element is the most significant and the most difficult to implement. Because it runs directly against the political logic that executed Vinogradov. Timoshenko cannot change that political logic. He can create operational space within it. He is walking a line between military necessity and political catastrophe, and he knows it. The reforms he implements are real. The institutional culture that produced the Raate Road is not reformed. It is temporarily suppressed by the urgency of the situation and the authority of a marshal who is personally trusted by Stalin. When the urgency passes, the culture reasserts itself. The Mannerheim Line breaks in February 1940, 11 days into Timoshenko's methodical artillery preparation, and Finland accepts armistice terms in March. The territorial concessions Finland makes, the Karelian Isthmus, the western shore of Lake Ladoga, the Rybaki Peninsula in the Arctic, are significant. They are less than Stalin originally demanded. The Winter War is, in narrow territorial terms, a Soviet victory. In every other measure, casualties, duration, institutional damage, international reputation, it is a catastrophe. The Soviet Union loses, by most historian estimates, approximately 126,000 dead and a far larger number of wounded frostbite casualties and men who simply disappear into the Finnish forest and are never recovered. The figures are contested in their specifics, but consistent in their order of magnitude. Finland loses 25,000 dead. The ratio is the number that travels, 4-to-1 or 5-to-1 in some calculations, and it travels because it is the number that matters for everything that follows. What follows is Hitler's calculation. The German military attaches in Helsinki and the intelligence assessments produced by the Wehrmacht's Foreign Armies branch in the spring and summer of 1940 are among the most consequential documents of the Second World War, not because of what they say, but because of what they choose to emphasize. They emphasize the motti battles, the Raate Road, the encirclements north of Lake Ladoga. They emphasize the command failures, the equipment failures, the training failures. They note, with the thoroughness of professional military analysts, every visible symptom of Soviet institutional dysfunction. What they do not adequately weigh, what Hitler does not adequately weigh in his reading of these reports, is the speed with which the Soviet military system identified its failures and began correcting them. The Timoshenko reforms are visible in the reports. They are assessed as insufficient. The assessment is not wrong in February 1940. It is wrong in June 1941, by which point the Soviet military has had 16 additional months to continue the process of institutional learning that began on the Raate Road. The road that Vinogradov's column froze on in January 1940 functions in the history of the Second World War as one of those specific geographical points where large strategic consequences later traced back to small initial decisions. If the Ninth Army had not sent the 44th Division up the Raate Road, if the column had maintained tighter march discipline that prevented it from stringing out over 40 kilometers, if Vinogradov had been given the institutional space to request withdrawal at the moment when the tactical situation on the road became clear, any of these differences would not have prevented the Winter War, would not have prevented Finnish resistance, might not even have saved the 163rd Division in Suomussalmi. But the catastrophic destruction of the 44th Division on the Raate Road, visible to the world in the form of the frozen column photographed by Finnish and foreign correspondents, shaped the German strategic assessment of the Red Army in a way that a less complete Soviet defeat would not have. Hitler needed the Raate Road. He needed it to be as bad as it was. He needed the image of 17,000 frozen men on 40 kilometers of forest road to confirm what he had already decided about Soviet military capability. The Raate Road gave him that image, and he used it to authorize a decision that would kill 27 million Soviet citizens and end Germany as a great power. The 44th Division disintegrates. The units at the western end of the column, nearest to Suomussalmi, and the trapped 163rd Division are destroyed first. The units at the eastern end, closest to the Soviet border, survive longest. Some elements managed to break through Finnish positions on the road and return to Soviet territory in disorder, without their weapons and without most of their vehicles. By the time the Finnish forces have finished with the Raate Road in the first week of January 1940, the wreckage on the road extends for 30 kilometers. Historians estimate the Soviet 44th Division loses approximately 17,000 men in the engagement, the great majority of them to cold rather than to direct Finnish fire. The Finnish forces under Silasvuo lose, by some accounts, fewer than 200 killed in the operation against the 44th. The ratio is not a combat ratio, it is an environmental ratio. The Finnish army weaponized the Finnish winter. The 44th Division was killed by Finland before Silasvuo's men finished it. The equipment left on the Raate Road is enormous in quantity and almost surreal in condition. 40 kilometers of frozen road are covered with Soviet military hardware. Tanks with their engines seized, artillery pieces standing upright with their barrels pointed at the sky. Supply trucks stopped in the positions they occupied when the road was cut and the drivers left them. Horses dead in their traces still attached to the sleds they were pulling. The material is frozen solid. Finnish soldiers walk among it in the days after the battle and catalogue what they find. 50 tanks, several hundred motor vehicles, dozens of artillery pieces, field kitchens, radio equipment, medical supplies, ammunition by the crate, unopened food containers that the men in the pockets could not reach because there were Finnish riflemen between them and the supply sleds. The road, visible from Finnish reconnaissance aircraft in the days after the battle, looks like a photograph of something that should not exist. The entirety of a modern division's equipment, arranged on a road in precise column order, frozen in the position it occupied when the column died. The Raate Road is not an isolated catastrophe. It is the most photogenic and most completely documented of a pattern of Soviet failures that runs across the entire northern sector of the Winter War front. At the same time that the 44th Division is dying on the road from Raate, elements of the Soviet 54th Division are encircled north of Lake Ladoga in conditions nearly identical to those on the Raate Road. The 18th Division, operating further north toward the village of Loimola, is being methodically destroyed by Finnish forces using the same motti techniques that Silasvuo is applying with such effect against Vinogradov's column. The Soviet Ninth Army's entire operational concept, advance along the available roads, seize the road junctions, drive to the Gulf of Bothnia, is collapsing simultaneously across a 300-kilometer front. What is happening to the 44th Division on the Raate Road is happening, in variations of scale and specific terrain, to every Soviet formation in the northern sector that has attempted to execute the plan as written. The plan as written assumes terrain that does not exist, Finnish resistance that does not materialize in the expected form, and Soviet tactical flexibility that cannot be produced on short notice by an army whose institutional culture has spent 2 years punishing the exercise of individual judgment. The plan fails everywhere simultaneously. The Raate Road is where the failure is most complete and most visible. It is where the snow is deepest and the column longest and the freezing most thorough. It becomes, through the accident of its photographic documentation and the completeness of the Soviet loss, the emblem of what the entire Northern Front looked like that January. The Finnish soldiers who hold the line in that sector know that what they are doing is extraordinary. They do not know, because they cannot see the larger pattern from their positions in the forest, that they are doing it everywhere at once. The execution of Aleksei Vinogradov takes place in front of the surviving officers and men of the 44th Division on the road itself or near it. Accounts vary on the precise location, though the symbolic dimension of the choice, if the accounts are accurate, is clear enough. He is charged with cowardice and incompetence, which, in the Soviet military political framework of 1939, are not distinct categories. The trial, if it can be called that, takes a matter of hours. The sentence is predetermined by the political logic of what has happened. 17,000 men, an entire division with its full equipment destroyed on a single road in 3 weeks. Someone must be responsible. The system requires that someone be visibly, terminally responsible, so that the institution can claim that the failure was individual rather than systemic. Vinogradov is the individual. His political commissar, a man named Pachomenko, is executed alongside him. 2 regimental commanders receive lesser sentences: imprisonment, the labor camps, that in the conditions of 1940 represent a delayed death rather than an alternative to it. The 44th Division, or what remains of it, is reconstituted under new commanders and eventually returned to combat operations. It carries the memory of the Raate Road in the way any institution carries a catastrophe that its leadership has decided must be attributed to individuals rather than examined as a systemic failure. That decision, the decision to execute Vinogradov rather than understand what happened on the Raate Road, is itself one of the most consequential decisions the Soviet military makes in the Winter War, because it forecloses the honest institutional accounting that might have produced reform. The Red Army after the Winter War does conduct some reform. The Timoshenko reforms of the spring and summer of 1940, following the replacement of Meretskov with Marshal Semyon Timoshenko as commander of the Finnish operation, introduce improvements in winter warfare doctrine, in the supply of adequate cold weather equipment, in the training of troops for the specific conditions of northern forest combat. These reforms are real. They contribute to the Soviet success at breaking the Mannerheim Line in February 1940. But they are reforms conducted under institutional pressure, in a political system that has just killed the man who commanded the 44th Division for the crime of being in command when it was destroyed, and the pressure of that political logic shapes the reforms. You reform the training, you improve the equipment, you do not openly examine the command culture that prevented Vinogradov from requesting withdrawal at the moment when withdrawal would have saved the division. Because examining that command culture means examining the political conditions that created it, and those political conditions are not available for examination. Adolf Hitler, studying the Winter War from Berlin, draws conclusions from the evidence of the Raate Road and Suomussalmi and the other motti battles that are not entirely wrong, but are disastrously weighted. He concludes that the Red Army is institutionally broken, that the purges of 1937 and 1938 have destroyed its professional brain trust and replaced competence with political reliability, that the army revealed in Finland is a hollow organization incapable of complex combined arms operations, that it will collapse under sufficient pressure. He is right about the hollowness. He is wrong about the permanence of it. The Soviet military system that destroyed Vinogradov and refused to examine the Raate Road honestly is also the system that, between 1940 and 1941, absorbs the lessons of Finland in the compressed, brutal way that Soviet institutions absorb lessons when survival is at stake. By June 1941, when Germany invades the Soviet Union, the Red Army is still deeply flawed. It is no longer the army that walked onto the Raate Road. Hitler's assessment of it, calibrated on the Winter War evidence, misses the trajectory. The Raate Road is studied at military academies for reasons that are instructive to consider carefully. It is not primarily a lesson about Finnish tactical genius, though Silasvuo's handling of the motti operations is a genuinely impressive piece of improvised combined arms warfare conducted with minimal resources. It is not primarily a lesson about Soviet military incompetence, though the institutional dysfunction exposed at every level of the Soviet command in Finland is real and documented. It is primarily a lesson about what happens when the conditions assumed by a military doctrine turn out to be absent from the actual operational environment, and when the institutional culture of the army in question prevents the officers who discover this mismatch from saying so clearly and acting on the discovery. Vinogradov knew on the morning of December 27th that his division was strung out on a road that the Finns could cut. He knew that his men did not have adequate cold weather equipment for a sustained operation in Finnish forest. He knew that the plan assigned to him assumed a rate of advance that the terrain made impossible. He knew these things. He did not have the institutional space to say them in a way that could have changed the outcome, because the political structure around him had made saying them, making the case for a change of plan, requesting withdrawal, acknowledging the mismatch between the plan and the ground, into a species of crime. He folded the map, he gave the order to advance, and the forest closed around the 44th Division. The physical evidence left on the Raate Road after the Finnish forces complete their work is documented in photographs that circulate among military observers across Europe and, eventually, the world. Finnish journalists and foreign correspondents are given controlled access to the road in the weeks after the battle. The photographs they produce are not posed. They are records of a reality so complete and so strange, the orderly frozen column, the ranks of vehicles in the positions they occupied when the road was cut, the horses still in their traces, that their impact on military professionals who see them is disproportionate to the time spent looking at them. The photographs are studied in Berlin and in London and in Washington and in Tokyo. They are studied by men who are trying to understand what the Winter War has revealed about the Soviet military, and what the photographs appear to reveal. What they are taken to reveal by the observers who matter most is that the Soviet military cannot handle complexity, cannot operate effectively in non-standard terrain, and cannot maintain unit cohesion under the kind of pressure that the Raate Road represents. This reading of the photographs is not wrong. It is incomplete. It does not show what the Soviet military will look like after a year of emergency correction. It shows what it looked like at its worst moment, frozen onto a Finnish road in a condition of maximum institutional failure. And it shows this to observers who are predisposed by their own strategic interests to believe that what they are seeing is permanent rather than transient. The Finnish soldiers who walk the road in the days after the battle describe an experience that none of them have language adequate for. Corporal Armas Ihalainen, a ski trooper from the Oulu region whose memoir was published decades after the war, writes of walking the road 3 days after the last Soviet resistance had been suppressed and finding the column arranged exactly as it had been when it was alive, the vehicles in sequence, the artillery at the intervals they had maintained on the march, the supply sleds in their assigned positions at the rear, except that everything on the road was dead and frozen in place with the specific rigidity of objects that have been at -40 degrees for weeks. He writes of finding a Soviet officer sitting in the cab of a supply truck with his hands on the steering wheel and his eyes open, and of not being immediately certain, in the grey Finnish afternoon light, whether the man was alive or not. He was not alive. The specific quality of the cold at that extreme, Ihalainen notes, is that it preserves rather than destroys. The men on the road looked like men who had stopped rather than men who had been killed. And this quality of stoppedness, of a column that had simply ceased to move, was more disturbing to the Finnish soldiers who walked it than any battlefield they had seen with the immediate evidence of violence. The road was not a battlefield, it was a stopped world. Colonel Silasvuo's after-action report submitted to Finnish Army headquarters in the second week of January 1940 is characteristically precise and characteristically modest in its claims. He does not describe the destruction of the 44th Division as a tactical triumph in the rhetorical sense. He describes it as the product of the application of specific methods to specific conditions, and he notes, with the care of a man who understands that wars are not won on a single road, that the methods that worked on the Raate Road will work only as long as the conditions that made them effective persist. As long as the Soviet army cannot or will not learn to operate in Finnish forest in Finnish winter with the tactical flexibility and local knowledge that Finnish forces bring to the fight. He is not complacent. He knows that the Soviet Union has approximately 4 times the population of Finland and approximately 40 times the industrial capacity. He knows that what his forces have demonstrated on the Raate Road is not a permanent advantage. It is a window. and the window will close when the Soviet military applies sufficient mass and sufficient preparation to overcome the disadvantages that the forest and the cold have imposed on it. He is correct. The window closes at the Mannerheim Line in February 1940, when Timoshenko's artillery preparation takes the line apart, with the systematic application of overwhelming firepower that no amount of Finnish tactical skill can neutralize. The road is still there. It is paved now. Finnish families drive along it in summer and do not think, necessarily, about what is frozen beneath the surface, about the winter when the trees on either side of the road held Finnish riflemen and the road itself held 17,000 Soviet soldiers who had been given an impossible order by a man who could not afford to say that the order was impossible. The lakes on either side of the road reflect the summer sky. In winter, the forest is as dense and as dark as it was in January 1940. The cold is the same cold. The trees are the same trees. What is not the same is the army that walks into it. The Soviet Union that fought the Winter War spent the following year relearning at enormous cost what the 44th Division tried to teach it on the Raate Road. Whether it learned enough and whether it learned it in time is the question that the summer of 1941 would answer, at a scale that made the Raate Road look like a rehearsal. Here is the question I cannot get out of my head. Vinogradov knew the position was untenable. He sent the radio messages. He asked for withdrawal. He was refused. When the execution order came, was he a scapegoat for a systemic failure that began in Moscow? Or does command responsibility mean that the general who advances a division into a trap he can see is genuinely culpable, regardless of the political pressure on him? Was Vinogradov a victim of the Soviet system or a commander who failed his men? Leave your answer below and watch this next video.